Chapter 4. The Artificer's Solitude. The early morning was thick with mist, rolling low over the fields like a creeping tide. The heavy footfalls of horses pressed into the damp earth, their riders cloaked in silence as they moved under the pale light of the waning moon. The walls of Veletria had long since faded into the distance, swallowed by the dark expanse of the wilderness beyond. Reid rode near the front, flanked by Sir Aldrich and Cassius. Behind them, 10 knights trailed in a staggered formation, their armor muted by blackened cloaks to avoid catching the faint glimmers of moonlight. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp soil and distant wood smoke, a reminder that enemy patrols weren't far. "This route will take us through the lowland forests before cutting north through the crag fields," Reid murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir Aldrich nodded, eyes scanning the road ahead. "We'll be vulnerable in the open stretches," he said. "Imperial outriders will be sweeping the lands for signs of movement after their loss." Reid adjusted the grip on his reins. "That's why we don't move like an army," he said. "We move like ghosts." The knights behind them said nothing, their discipline unwavering. The warriors Aldrich had selected were hardened veterans, men who had fought in countless skirmishes. They knew when to speak and when to keep their silence. Cassius, who had been quiet for much of the journey, finally exhaled. "They're already closing their grip around this region," he murmured. "This isn't just about reinforcing their forces. They're cutting off escape routes, locking this land into a siege before the real attack begins. They're tightening the noose," Reid muttered. "And we're walking right into it." The group rode in silence for another hour before reaching the forest's edge. Tall pines stretched into the sky like sentinels, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures absent. Reid raised a fist, and the company halted. He scanned the tree line, instincts flaring. Something about this stretch of road felt wrong. Aldrich leaned over. "What is it?" "Too quiet," Reid muttered. Cassius stiffened in his saddle. "You think we're being watched?" Reid dismounted, crouching to examine the dirt. He brushed his fingers over a set of indentations, hoof prints, barely a day old, leading into the tree line before vanishing. Not a scouting party. This was something else. "Patrols came through here recently," he said. "But they didn't stick to the road. They cut through the trees." He glanced up at Aldrich. "They were searching for something. Or someone," Cassius muttered. Reid stood. "We'll take the longer route," he said. "Cutting through the forest will slow us, but it's safer than riding blind into an ambush." Aldrich didn't argue. He raised his hand, signaling the knights to shift formation. The group veered off the main road, moving through the dense undergrowth. The further they went, the heavier the air became, the forest closing in around them. Cassius rode alongside Reid, his expression unreadable. "You understand how dangerous this journey is, don't you?" Reid glanced at him. "I wouldn't be here otherwise." Cassius let out a quiet chuckle. "You remind me of him?" Reid raised an eyebrow. "Valen?" The mage nodded, his hands tightening on the reins. He never knew when to stop either, even when everyone told him that his path would lead to ruin. Reid smirked. "Sounds like my kind of man," Cassius exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't understand." He wasn't just brilliant. He was obsessed. He spent decades trying to prove that magic and machines could coexist, that they weren't meant to be at odds. Reid frowned. "And?" Cassius hesitated, his gaze drifting to the darkness beyond the trees. And one by one, every machine he tried to restore failed. It wasn't a matter of decay or rust or missing components. Something was stopping them from working. "Something?" Reid repeated. "What do you mean?" Cassius shook his head. "That's the mystery, isn't it? Everyone believed that the old machines simply broke down, that magic overpowered them. But Valen was convinced something else was at play. Something deliberate." Reid remained silent, letting the weight of Cassius's words settle in. "The records say the old machines failed all at once," Cassius continued. "Not over centuries, not gradually. It was as if something, or someone, flipped a switch and erased them." He hesitated. "As if they were deliberately killed." Reid stiffened. "You're saying something shut them all down?" Cassius nodded. Valen believed it wasn't natural. He thought something, or someone, erased them from the world. Reid mulled over the thought. It was a terrifying idea, a force powerful enough to render an entire age of technology obsolete in an instant. What happened to him? Reid asked. Why go into hiding? Cassius sighed. Valen's research wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. The Empire started sending spies, asking questions, searching his laboratories. The more he learned, the more they wanted him silenced. Reid frowned. Then why didn't they just kill him? Cassius hesitated, his fingers tightening on the reins. Because he left before they could. Disappeared into the mountains before they ever made their move. Sir Aldrich, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. And you think they never stopped looking for him? Cassius nodded grimly. The Empire doesn't let go of something it wants. A heavy silence followed. Reid exhaled, scanning the trees ahead. Then we'd better hope we get to him before they do. They pressed on, moving deeper into the wilds. The further they rode, the harder it was to tell where Veletria's influence ended and the unknown began. The roads faded, turning into narrow animal trails. The trees grew denser, the sky barely visible through the tangled canopy above. The land felt old, forgotten. Reid knew they had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back now. The journey stretched long and uncertain ahead of them. For the first 2 days, the terrain shifted gradually, from well-trodden roads into the untamed wilds of the frontier. The deeper they rode, the more Veletria's presence faded, swallowed by the towering trees and the oppressive quiet of an untouched land. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth, moss-covered stone, and the faint traces of something older, something forgotten. Reid kept his focus ahead, scanning the landscape with a soldier's instincts. The land itself had changed beneath them, growing harsher with every passing league. The soft hills of Veletria had given way to dense, uneven forests, tangled underbrush, and streams cutting deep into the rock. Travel was slow, forcing them to weave their way along forgotten hunting trails. By the second evening, even those had thinned, forcing them to navigate by memory and instinct. They made camp in the shadow of a rocky outcrop, the fire kept low to avoid drawing unwanted attention. The night pressed in around them, thick with the hum of unseen insects and the occasional rustle of nocturnal predators in the undergrowth. It was a land that did not welcome outsiders. As the fire flickered between them, Cassius finally broke the long-held silence. Velen didn't leave just to escape exile, he murmured, staring into the flames. Reid looked up from where he was sharpening his knife. You've said that before. What aren't you telling us? Cassius exhaled, adjusting his cloak against the evening chill. His research wasn't just dangerous, it was damning. The rulers of the world weren't content to dismiss it. They feared it. And the Empire. They took an unnatural interest in it. Sir Aldrich, who had been sitting in stoic silence, finally turned his gaze toward Cassius. Why? Cassius hesitated before speaking again. Because he was close. Closer than anyone in history to bridging the gap between magic and machinery. Closer than even I realized until the day he disappeared. There was a long pause before Sir Botolph, one of Aldrich's most trusted knights, spoke up. If he was so close, why did he flee? Cassius's jaw tightened. Because he had no choice. He wasn't just being watched, he was being hunted. Aldrich's frown deepened. Hunted? By whom? The Empire, Cassius said. At first it was spies. Questions whispered in the corridors of academies, requests for private meetings that grew increasingly insistent. Then it was disappearances. Colleagues of his, those who worked on similar research, vanished without a trace. Some fled. Others weren't so lucky. Reid set his knife down on his knee. And Velen? He knew they would come for him. He had seen it happen before, so he did what no one expected. Cassius looked up, his expression grim. He vanished first. Aldrich let out a slow breath. And you think they never stopped looking? Cassius nodded. Velen was the last of his kind. The only one with knowledge of the old machines, the only one who still believed they could be revived. If the Empire had any reason to fear him before, imagine what they would do if they found him now. A silence fell over the group. The fire crackled between them, its glow dancing across the tense faces of the knights. Reid exhaled, glancing out into the darkness beyond the fire's light. Then let's make sure we get to him before they do. For the next 2 days, the mountains loomed ever closer, rising like jagged stone sentinels against the sky. The air grew thinner, cooler, and the once dense forests began to give way to rocky foothills. The journey became more treacherous. the trails narrow and winding, some barely more than crumbling ledges above steep drops. By the fourth day, they had entered the true wilderness. Reid called for a halt near midday, as they crested a ridge overlooking a ruined valley below. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had encountered so far. The ruined sanctum, it was an ancient place, long forgotten by time. Beneath them, remnants of stone structures jutted out from the earth like broken bones, half buried by nature's slow reclamation. Vines clung to crumbling walls, and shattered archways loomed like silent guardians over what had once been something greater. Cassius rode forward, eyes scanning the ruins with a careful, practiced gaze. Valen always spoke of this place, he said quietly. Not many know it even exists. Aldrich nudged his horse closer. What was it? A stronghold, Cassius said. Or a temple. No one truly knows. The oldest records barely mention it. What we do know is that it was abandoned long before even the earliest histories of Veletria were written. Reid eyed the ruins below. The place had the feel of something ancient, something lost. There was no mistaking the sense of weight in the air, like the past itself had settled here, refusing to fade. Cassius exhaled. Valen knew this would be the last place they would look for him. That's why he came here. Reid turned to him. You said before that he vanished. Not where. Do you know exactly where to find him? Cassius shook his head. No, only that his workshop is somewhere among these ruins. But it won't be easy to find. Reid muttered a curse under his breath. So we search. The knights exchanged glances. Searching these ruins could take time. Time they might not have. Then Botolph stiffened, his gaze dropping to the ground ahead. Sir, he said quietly. Reid followed his gaze. Tracks. Boot prints. Fresh enough that the rain from 2 nights ago hadn't washed them away. They led deeper into the ruins, winding through the collapsed structures like the trail of a serpent. And they weren't alone. Reid knelt, brushing his fingers over a snapped branch. Someone's been here recently. Cassius's expression darkened. Then we're already too late. Reid rose, scanning the ruins ahead. The jagged structures stood in eerie silence, the wind whispering through cracks in the stone. No movement, no sound, but someone had been here, and they might still be watching. Reid rested a hand on his sidearm. Spread out, he ordered, his voice low. We find Valen. Now. The knights readied their weapons and moved forward. Whatever awaited them in the ruins, they would be ready. The knights moved cautiously through the ruins, their boots crunching against the dust and loose rubble that covered the ancient stone floors. The air was thick with the scent of age, mold, decay, and something metallic that lingered just at the edge of perception. The remains of the once grand stronghold stretched around them, its stone archways and collapsed walls barely holding on to their shape after what must have been centuries of abandonment. Reid took point, his sidearm at the ready. He didn't like how silent it was. It wasn't the stillness of an empty place. It was the silence of something waiting. Sir Aldrich signaled his men to fan out, his sword drawn. Search the area. Check for signs of recent activity. The knights moved in pairs, their torches casting flickering light against the cold, dead walls. Cassius remained near Reid, his eyes darting over the ruins with barely contained urgency. This was once a fortress, Cassius murmured. But the stronghold itself wasn't Valen's interest. He came for what lay beneath. Reid glanced at him. Beneath? Cassius nodded. This place, this entire site, it was built over something older. Long before the rise of the Empire, before magic became dominant, there were those who sought to harness both forces, technology and sorcery. Valen believed this was once a center of their research. Reid's grip on his weapon tightened. And now it's been reduced to ruins. Cassius's lips pressed into a thin line. Because someone wanted it that way. Reid exhaled through his nose, scanning their surroundings. He had been in war zones, in abandoned cities where battles had left nothing but husks of civilization behind. This place felt no different. One of the knights called out from the far side of the chamber. Over here! Reid and Cassius moved toward him, stepping over fallen beams and shattered stone. As they reached the knight, they found themselves standing in what had once been a workshop, though now it was in complete disarray. Scrolls and parchment littered the floor, many torn or trampled underfoot. Wooden tables had been overturned, and strange, delicate instruments lay shattered beneath them. In the center of the room, a heavy metal construct, a frame of some long-forgotten device, had been ripped open, its intricate workings exposed like the ribs of a corpse. Reid crouched, brushing his hand over the metal surface. It was smooth, too well crafted to be the work of the Empire's crude forges. He tapped it with a knuckle, and it rang with a strange resonance. "Not Imperial," he muttered. Cassius moved quickly to a nearby table, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a half-burned parchment. His eyes scanned the faded ink. "This is Valen's handwriting." He turned to Reid. "He was here recently." Reid frowned. "And now he's not." Aldrich, standing near the entrance, nudged something with his boot. "This explains why." They turned to see him pointing to a series of deep gouges in the stone floor. Drag marks. Heavy ones. The scuff marks led toward the entrance of the chamber before vanishing into the rubble-strewn hallway. "He didn't leave willingly," Aldrich said grimly. Reid followed the trail with his eyes, then spotted something near the entrance. He stepped forward and knelt, his fingers brushing against the carved surface of a discarded emblem. It was the mark of the Empire. His jaw clenched. "They were here." Cassius looked stricken. "They took him." Reid straightened, slipping the emblem into his pocket. "How long ago?" Aldrich inspected the dust along the floor. "Not long. The debris hasn't settled completely. A day? Less." Cassius exhaled sharply, frustration clear in his expression. "Damn it. We were close." Reid turned back to the remains of the workshop, his mind working through the implications. If the Empire had taken Valen, they hadn't done it out of sheer malice. They needed something from him. That meant they wouldn't kill him. Not yet. "We need to find out what they were after," Reid said. He scanned the wreckage and motioned to Cassius. "You know his work better than anyone. What was he working on before this happened?" Cassius hesitated, his fingers hovering over the wreckage. He exhaled sharply, pushing aside broken glass, overturning scattered scrolls. Then, his breath caught. He lifted a single, partially unrolled manuscript. "This," Cassius trailed off, his eyes locked onto the pages. Reid stepped beside him. "What is it?" Cassius swallowed. "His last project." "The tether principle." Reid frowned. "That the theory you mentioned before? About using magic to stabilize machines?" Cassius nodded, his hands tightening around the parchment. "More than that. If he was right, this wasn't just a theory. It was a solution." Reid's mind raced. If that was true, then Fenrir wasn't doomed to failure. "And he was close to making this work?" he asked. Cassius let out a slow breath. "It seems so. But judging by the state of this place, without asking Valen, we can't be sure." Aldrich looked grim. "Then we're running out of time." Reid scanned the chamber one last time, then turned to the knights. "Search everything. We need to know exactly what the Empire was after." As the knights began their search, Cassius knelt beside one of the fallen devices on the ground. It was no larger than a man's fist, its metal casing worn but still largely intact. He turned it over in his hands, brushing dust from its surface. "What is it?" Reid asked. Cassius's brow furrowed. "I don't know." His fingers traced along the grooves in the metal, then stopped as his eyes widened slightly. "But I think it was meant to move." Reid's gaze snapped to him. "A machine?" Cassius nodded. "A small one. An automaton, perhaps. But," he hesitated, turning the device in his hands, "this wasn't built by Valen. It's older. Much older." Reid frowned. "How old are we talking?" Cassius exhaled. "Centuries, at least. Maybe longer. If these machines once functioned, then whatever knowledge created them has been lost to time." His grip on the device tightened. "Or buried." Reid exchanged a glance with Aldrich, then looked back to Cassius. "You think the Empire found a way to bring them back?" Cassius set the device aside carefully. "I don't know. But if they've taken Valen, then they believe there's something worth reviving." Reid's expression hardened. "Then we'd better figure out what it is before they do." Reid clenched his jaw as the weight of Cassius's words settled over them. The Empire wasn't just hunting Valen. They were after something bigger, something that had been hidden, buried in time, waiting to be rediscovered. If they succeeded, if they managed to unlock whatever secrets Valen had been pursuing, it could tip the balance of power in ways none of them were prepared for. Cassius was visibly shaken, his fingers tightening around the rusted automaton he had picked up. "Valen never saw magic and machines as enemies," he murmured, his voice tight with emotion. "He always believed they could work together, that one could strengthen the other. He was mocked for it, exiled. But if the Empire has taken him, it means they think he was right. Sir Aldrich exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand across his beard. Then we have two problems, he said. One, we don't know how much they've already learned. And two, we have no idea how long before they force Valen to give up what he knows. Reid nodded grimly. Then we find out. He turned back to the overturned furniture, the broken remnants of Valen's work. If the old artificer was as paranoid as Cassius claimed, he wouldn't have left his most important research in the open. He would have had a fail-safe, something hidden, something meant to be found only by someone who knew where to look. Cassius seemed to come to the same conclusion. He moved toward the far end of the chamber, stepping over shattered glass and scattered parchment. His eyes scanned the walls, searching for something specific. He wouldn't have left it out in the open, he muttered. There must be something, Reid signaled to the others. Search everything. If there's anything left behind, we need to find it. The knights fanned out, their boots crunching over debris as they tore through the wreckage. Some lifted broken tables and overturned chairs. Others sifted through the remains of shattered bookshelves, scanning for anything that looked out of place. Minutes passed. Then Cassius stopped suddenly. Here. Reid was at his side in an instant. Cassius stood beside a heavy wooden table, its surface littered with scattered scrolls, torn pages, and broken quills. Dust coated everything, undisturbed for days, except for one stack of parchment pushed slightly askew. With careful hands, Cassius shifted the top layers aside, revealing a single scrap of parchment beneath them. Its edges were frayed, the ink hurried and smudged, as if it had been written in haste. He picked it up carefully, his hands shaking slightly as he read the words aloud. The Empire does not seek to destroy the old ways. They seek to claim them. A heavy silence fell over the room. Reid exchanged a glance with Aldrich. The meaning was clear. The Empire hadn't taken Valen just to silence him. They wanted his knowledge, his work, his secrets. And if they succeeded in forcing that knowledge from him, they wouldn't just use it. They would make it their own. Aldrich cursed under his breath. That means they already know more than we hoped. Reid's grip tightened around his sidearm. It also means Valen is still valuable to them. If he were expendable, they would have killed him. Sir Botolph, who had been scanning the room from near the entrance, finally spoke. That means we need to move. If the Empire plans to use what Valen knows, then every moment we waste is another step closer to them succeeding. Reid nodded. Watching Cassius carefully, Reid said, You seem to know a lot about this place. More than someone who's only read Valen's research. He narrowed his eyes. Is there something you're not telling me? Cassius hesitated before letting out a slow breath. A year ago I came here to find Valen. He sent me a message asking me to visit. He needed to show me something. He glanced around the ruined study, his expression darkening. Valen was already considered a heretic. I couldn't just announce I was leaving to see him. I traveled in secret, and that's how I know so much about his work. So tell me, Cassius, you knew him better than anyone. If Valen suspected this might happen, where else would he have hidden his work? Cassius hesitated. He never kept everything in one place. He believed in redundancy. Copies, notes, layered secrets? Aldrich frowned. Then there must be another cache somewhere in this place. Cassius exhaled, pushing a hand through his hair as he scanned the chamber. There is one place he might have hidden something, but... He hesitated. But what? Reid pressed. Cassius met his gaze. It's further in, near his private study. Reid glanced at Aldrich and Botolph. Then that's where we go. They moved quickly, navigating the ruined sanctum's crumbling halls. More remnants of Valen's work lay abandoned. Rusted tools, half-assembled machines, sketches and diagrams that were too damaged to make sense of. The deeper they went, the heavier the dust, the air thick with the weight of forgotten knowledge. Then they found it, a small chamber tucked away behind a collapsed wall. The door had been broken open, its hinges barely holding on. Inside, the room was ransacked, but not completely destroyed. Cassius stepped in cautiously, eyes darting around the mess. If he hid something, it would be somewhere he knew only I would check. Reid and Aldrich scanned the room while Cassius moved toward an old stone shelf. Dust coated its surface, but as he brushed his fingers along the edge, he felt something, an indentation. With a quiet breath, he pressed down. A panel opened, revealing a small, leather-bound notebook. Cassius pulled it free, hands trembling. This looks important. Reid stepped closer. What does it say? Cassius flipped through the pages, scanning quickly. This could be it. According to the notes here, it confirms Valen was on the verge of a breakthrough. It's got all his measurements, records, and more. Reid turned back to Cassius. Okay, this is still something. If we don't find him in time, at least we have a partial foundation to work from. A backup plan, in case we can't bring Valen back with us. Cassius hesitated. I can work with this, but it looks incomplete. If I had access to my workshop back at the castle, I could start testing. I'd have the tools, the material, but out here, it's impossible. Aldrich met Reid's gaze. Then we send Cassius back to the castle. Reid considered it. I agree, but let's not jump just yet. If Valen hid the rest of his work, it must still be here. We can't leave without it. Cassius clenched his jaw but gave a slow nod. Then we search. Reid turned to Aldrich. Split up, check everywhere. Aldrich nodded. Understood. Reid exhaled, his mind racing. They had a plan now, but time was running out, and before they could leave, they had to confirm one thing. Where the Empire had taken Valen. Suddenly Reid heard a sound. He snapped his gun up, every nerve on edge, but it was only the wind scraping over the ruins. But then, movement. A shadow slipped between the collapsed pillars. Reid's grip on his sidearm tightened as the sound echoed again, a faint rustling followed by the unmistakable scrape of movement against stone. The knights reacted instantly, drawing their weapons in a coordinated motion, fanning out to cover the exits. Aldrich gestured sharply, his expression hard. Who's there? Show yourself! The silence stretched. Dust drifted lazily in the dim torchlight. Then, from behind a half-collapsed pillar, something shifted. Reid adjusted his aim, his stance steady. The figure emerging was small, hunched, definitely not a soldier. A tangle of dark hair, a too-thin frame wrapped in a threadbare cloak, wide eyes darting between the armed warriors. A boy. He hesitated at the edge of the light, trembling, torn between fight and flight. The knights remained tense, waiting for a command. Cassius took a slow step forward, lowering his hands. Easy, he said gently. We're not here to hurt you. The boy flinched but didn't bolt. He was looking around the group of knights, searching, wary, until his gaze landed on Cassius. His breath hitched, recognition flashing across his face. Cassius? His voice cracked. Cassius frowned. You know me? The boy nodded rapidly, his entire body still shaking. You came here before. Valen spoke of you. His words tumbled out unsteady, desperate. He said if anything happened, if anyone came looking, I should... His voice choked off, and he pressed a dirty hand against his mouth, his fingers trembling violently. Cassius took another careful step forward. It's all right, he said, voice steady. You did the right thing. Reid lowered his sidearm just slightly, though he kept his attention sharp. What's your name, kid? The boy swallowed hard. Soren. Aldrich exchanged glances with Reid, still wary. What are you doing here? Soren dragged in a shuddering breath. I was with Master Valen when they came. I hid! His voice cracked, his fingers curling into fists. They took him. Cassius's expression darkened. When? Soren clenched his jaw, his thin frame tense as he fought for control. This morning. A sharp jolt ran through the group. Reid straightened, heart pounding. You're sure? Soren nodded frantically. I heard them talking. They weren't expecting him to fight back, but he did. He hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. I should have helped. Cassius shook his head firmly. You wouldn't have stood a chance. Soren swallowed hard and continued, his words rushing now. They were looking for something, not just Master Valen. They were tearing apart the workshop, searching. Reid's gaze sharpened. Searching for what? The boy hesitated, his brow furrowing. I don't know exactly, but they were angry. I heard one of them say, if it's not here, he'll tell us where to find it. Aldrich let out a slow breath. So they didn't get everything they were looking for. Reid exchanged glances with Cassius. Did Valen keep backups? Copies of his research? Soren hesitated, then nodded. He always said knowledge should never be kept in just one place. He had hiding spots. Cassius exhaled sharply. Then we need to find them. The boy shifted uncomfortably. I think I know where he would have left something. Reid's eyes narrowed. Show us. Soren hesitated, his gaze flicking between them. If I do, will you save him? Cassius placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. We're going to try. Soren searched his face for a long moment, then nodded. Follow me. The knights moved cautiously, keeping their weapons at the ready as the boy led them deeper into the ruins. Dust hung thick in the air, the walls closing in as they descended into a narrow passage. Soren stopped in front of what looked like nothing more than a cracked section of wall, but as he pressed his fingers against a barely noticeable groove, something shifted. A hidden panel opened, revealing a small alcove. Inside, wrapped carefully in aged cloth, were several thick scrolls and a battered leather-bound journal. Cassius stepped forward reverently, lifting the journal with care. His breath caught as he opened it, scanning the pages. This is it! It has to be! His voice was barely above a whisper. His fingers traced the text, flipping through quickly. Yes, this is the missing piece. The final refinement of the tether principle. His expression was tight with focus. With this, I could complete his work. Reid exhaled sharply. Then we have our answer, Aldrich grunted. He goes back to the castle. Cassius hesitated. But Valen, Reid cut in. If we don't make it back in time, this could be our only shot at stopping the Empire. He turned to Aldrich. 2 of your best knights escort him back to the castle first thing in the morning. The rest of us will go after Valen. Aldrich nodded. It shall be done. Cassius turned to Soren. You will come with me. It's not safe here. The boy hesitated, his fingers tightening at his sides. His voice was quieter now, but urgent. Before they left, I heard them talking. Reid turned sharply to face him. What did they say? Is this about where they took Valen? Soren swallowed before continuing. They made camp beyond the stream last night. They said they'd be riding at dawn for the Imperial stronghold in Kar Duran. Aldrich's expression darkened. Kar Duran is only a day's ride from here, just beyond the mountains. If Valen was taken there, it means the Empire doesn't plan to kill him, at least not yet. They want him for something. How many men did you see? Reid asked. Soren's brow furrowed. I don't know. A lot. More than the ones who came for him. They were waiting for the main force. Reid exchanged a grim look with Aldrich. Then we know where to start. Cassius exhaled, glancing between them. Be careful. If they're taking him there, they're not treating him like an ordinary prisoner. Reid nodded, then turned to the knights and Aldrich. We ride light and we ride fast. We'll track them in the morning and find out what we're dealing with before we make our move. He looked back at Soren, his tone softer. You did good, kid. Soren lowered his head slightly, shoulders still tense. Reid took a slow breath. They weren't too late. Not yet. At first light, we ride. Valen was alive. And now they had a lead, but time was slipping through their fingers.